Hi, and welcome to this recruitment webinar. This is a free webinar that was initially run live on the 26th of January 2023. And it's aimed at SMEs, managers, recruitment managers, hiring managers, and business owners. And it's all centered around top tips for improving your recruitment process. It's a tricky area these days, and we wanted to share some information that will help you hopefully tweak your current recruitment process and enable you to attract the best candidates going forward. There's about 45 minutes worth of content on this webinar. So a good recruitment process should enable you to, first of all, attract a diverse pool of the right candidates. We don't want the pool of candidates so wide that we're unable to select because we're inundated with candidates, many of whom might not be the right candidates that we're looking for. But equally, we don't want the pool to be so narrow that actually we don't have the opportunity to select because we're left with only maybe one or two candidates and almost therefore forced to select someone who might not be the best fit for the role. So we do want that diverse pool, but importantly, we want the candidates to be the right ones. And there are a number of ways we can help that to be the case, and we'll go through some of those later on. We also want to use the recruitment process to set the right expectations, and that's around things like the job role itself. So what is the candidate actually applying to do? What are the expectations in terms of benefits? What are we offering to the right candidate? And also things like what are they expecting when they come into the workplace? What kind of culture do we have? What kind of workplace are we offering? We want our recruitment process to do that so that we're ensuring that the person starts and they're fully aware of what they're entering into. If we don't do that, then we're likely to find a case where people leave quite soon after joining, or actually they don't start with us at all because we haven't managed those expectations. And we also need to be filtering out unsuitable candidates. This is the case with any kind of recruitment, but even more so, I would say, in those sectors where safer recruitment is vital. So health and social care, for example, where the candidate who is successful is going to be working with children or vulnerable people. We need to make sure that our recruitment process is stringent enough to filter out those who are unsuitable. Now, I would always look to do more detail around discrimination in general. In fact, we are doing a full webinar about discrimination and the Equality Act because it is a big topic in its own right, and that webinar is on the 29th of June. You can find the details for that on our website and on Eventbrite as well. I couldn't really do a recruitment webinar without mentioning it though, because protected characteristics are protected even at the recruitment stage. So we need to be very mindful that our recruitment process is not discriminatory. And here are the 9 protected characteristics. So if you aren't aware of those already, then I would definitely suggest attending our Discrimination and Equality Act webinar. Effectively, these protected characteristics mean that we cannot treat someone less favourably because they hold one of these characteristics. Now, of course, we all have an age. Not all of us will have pregnancy and maternity protection, for example, but we need to be mindful that some of these won't be obvious either. So some disabilities, for example, might need us to adjust the recruitment process, and those might not be physical disabilities. They might be learning difficulties. There might be neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia and that kind of thing. And we need to be very aware of that because, again, we're looking at attracting a diverse pool of candidates. And sometimes we can inadvertently put some people in these protected groups at a disadvantage, even if we didn't mean to. So be very mindful about discrimination and the fact that indirect discrimination can happen if we word our job advert wrong, for example. If we look to hire a junior individual, we might be looking at age discrimination risks there, and even just looking at where we advertise. Are we actually giving everybody equal opportunities to apply for this position? And it might come down to the selection techniques that we're using as well. So that's just a very quick reminder on discrimination. So thinking of recruitment then, the importance of preparation, we really can't underestimate it when it comes to recruitment. And we often find that clients are recruiting in a rush. A need has arisen very quickly because small businesses do change very quickly, or maybe someone's left and they're on a short notice period, and therefore we've suddenly got this need to recruit. But I would recommend that whether you've got a very short time frame or whether you are having the luxury of being able to plan out your recruitment process with a bit more time, preparing in any case is going to save you potentially a lot of money and time invested in a recruitment process that doesn't get you the right candidate. So, first of all, thinking about, has the role actually changed since you last recruited? Often, if someone's leaving, the temptation is to recruit very quickly to replace them. But we might not do that preparation in terms of actually thinking about what is their current job role. Is it the same as when we last actually looked at that job description? If the job description hasn't been updated in a while, now's a really good time to do it before we head out on that process of putting a job advert together, advertising, or using recruitment agencies and potentially giving them the wrong information about the job. And this is where a job specification is going to be really helpful. And within this, we're going to be setting out not only the purpose of the role and the tasks that are associated with that role, but also what the ideal candidate looks like. So we're going to explore that on the next slide in a bit more detail. Knowing the values that you are looking for is really key. Values-based recruitment is becoming a lot more popular, we're finding. And this is the basis that we are looking for someone who fits with not only the values of the existing team, but of the company as a whole. And actually, if we don't know what those values are, we obviously can't really recruit to match those up. But we tend to find that values are not something you can easily change in a person, whereas skills, sometimes behaviours, we can adapt slightly. So actually knowing what are the core values is really key, and we're going to talk more about values later on in this session. Planning in advance what selection methods you're going to use is important as well, because sometimes these are going to take time. We'll talk through some ideas for selection methods. Some will be more timely than others, and some will require more preparation than others. So knowing in advance will enable you to not only plan for that, but also set the expectation to the candidates so that they also know when they apply what the next stage is going to be. We aren't trying to catch people out when we're recruiting or trick them or throw things at them without any opportunity to prepare. So actually making sure we know in advance will help us look more professional, more prepared, and answer any questions, because that may well come up when candidates apply for the job. And remembering our discrimination slide from just a minute ago, we will also be able to then adapt those selection methods if we need to for someone, for example, who has a disability. And thinking about who will be involved in the recruitment process sounds really obvious, but we have come across situations before where we have put an advert out on instruction from a client who's really keen to recruit, only to find that the internal hiring manager who's in charge of CV sifting is on holiday for a week. And that can be really frustrating for the candidates who put the time into applying and then they don't hear anything. But also it can be an actual waste, because these days with recruitment, we do need to act really quickly. We need to get back to candidates as soon as they apply, and waiting a week before even looking at the CV isn't necessarily going to get the best results out of that recruitment process. So actually knowing who's going to be involved, knowing what their diary looks like in advance, will help with that preparation and make sure you're not potentially missing out on good candidates or disengaging those good ones who do apply. So we mentioned the job specification just a second ago, and it is worth spending a good amount of time on this document. And this is where you really consolidate your thinking about exactly what the job entails and what the key responsibilities of the job are. So once we know the main purpose of the role, and this could be actually a paragraph, it doesn't have to be a bullet pointed list, actually thinking about how you would describe the importance of this role, what does it do for the business, can really help focus your thinking in that sense, rather than getting too bogged down with the day-to-day tasks, because really we're thinking about the overall impact of the role. And thinking about the responsibilities and accountabilities as well. including whether this person may have any management duties, what are their sole responsibilities, because that level of responsibility will help determine what kind of person you are looking for as well, and that will help with forming a job advert later down the line. Thinking about what skills, knowledge, and experience are essential for the job is really important, and I would often highlight the essentials first, and then we might have desirable skills, experience, and knowledge. So actually thinking about what is absolutely vital, what could we not deal with if someone came to us and didn't possess this particular knowledge or experience. It might even be a certain qualification or a certain registration, something like that, that you really can't do without. And then have desirable skills and knowledge. It might be more desirable that someone is maybe got more experience in the industry, for example, but is it necessary? And that's what you really need to separate here, just to make sure we're not unnecessarily missing out on otherwise good candidates. And thinking about values and behaviours, I've mentioned values already, and I will do again on the on the next slide. But actually thinking about this is as a holistic approach to recruitment. So we're not just looking for the obvious skills, experience, can they do the job? Actually, what values and behaviours do we want this person to demonstrate? And I will help you a little bit with that on the next slide. But always think about that question: what's essential? What's desirable? And ask yourself why, or even better, get someone else to ask you why. It's often really good when you're putting these things together to have someone just challenge your thinking a little bit and not necessarily disagree with you, but to just ask you that question. Why does this person need to have 5 years experience? Why does this person need that skill to be considered for this role? Is that not something we could train? Someone asking those questions can really just help you avoid that sometimes narrow thinking that we can go down, especially when we're busy. So values then. Values are the deep fundamental beliefs that you hold. We all hold them. They often come from our parents or perhaps someone that we looked up to when we were younger. We'll often find that friends and partners will share at least some of the same values. And when people don't have values that are the same or that aren't aligned, that's often where we find conflict, because values are the guiding principles that dictate our behaviours and actions. So you can see that if those are not marrying up nicely with someone else's, there's potentially going to be a clash there. It doesn't mean to say that we need to have the same personality as our friends or partners, but we will have chosen those people to be part of our lives because we do share those same common values, at least, like I say, some of them. And if you don't, these are probably the areas where you might bicker from time to time. And this is one of the things that we find with workplaces as well, where conflict often arises, is where people's values are not necessarily aligned. So, as an example, if being on time and punctual is something that's really important to an individual and something that they strongly believe in, then that's a value of theirs, being on time, being punctual. And anyone who then is regularly late for things, whether that's a meeting or coming around for dinner, that's going to cause this person frustration and it's going to annoy them. And if, let's say, someone who grew up being taught that you must be punctual for things, therefore they place a huge importance on being on time, then they have a partner who's a bit more chilled out, they don't really see the importance. Well, what happens? We end up with arguments when they're trying to get to the airport on time, when they're going to a function of some sort, they're going to argue. So if those are things that happen in our personal relationships, it only makes sense that this also happens in our workplace relationships as well. And there are a few other examples. There are many examples where different values can show themselves up. We see a lot of examples of corporate values like we have fun, we work as a team, we work with integrity, those kind of values. And you can see straight away if someone doesn't share the same values, someone doesn't want to have fun when they come to work, it's going to start causing problems at some point. And your employment relationships will be much more enjoyable and much more productive, with less chance of conflict if you recruit people with those shared values And hopefully you share those as an individual as well. So moving that upper level to the company's values, it's the same premise, really. These are the principles by which the company wants all of its employees to work day to day and demonstrate. So these are practices that could be seen almost. So someone could observe the team working and could probably have a good guess at what some of the values are, and they provide a clear measure of performance as well if people are behaving in those certain ways that demonstrate the values. And a company's values should or must, I would say, be aligned to the core values of the owner. If that isn't aligned, then it's really not going to work. And values aren't just the words that are on the wall or the things that we bring out on the team day once a year. They should be the day-to-day culture and also visible to customers as well as the staff internally. And they do improve performance of the business if people are working to shared values as well. And there's loads of research around that. So, for example, you can imagine having a company value of environmentally friendly. If you don't practice that and you've got an owner who's driving around in a fuel guzzling car of some sort and there's no recycle bins in the office, that's really not going to mean anything if you have environmentally friendly as a value. So it's really got to be the things that are being practiced day in, day out. And you can see then that actually recruiting to those values is going to more likely bring in people who are the right fit. So let's move on then to placing your vacancy. Once we've identified through that person specification or job specification the kind of person we're looking for, we can start to form a really good advert that highlights the key bits of the role and talks about the kind of person that we're looking for. And we've then got so many options these days about where to place the vacancy. And it does need considerable thought. It'll largely depend on the role that you're recruiting for. The budgets for these various options can vary hugely. Some of these are free, some will cost quite a bit of money. So the more senior and the more technical the role is, the more likely that there'll need to be a higher budget for sourcing where your candidates are going to come from. And that might be recruitment agencies, might be headhunting and that kind of thing. But there are lots of cheaper and even free options. So social media, for example, unless you're paying to boost posts, most social media advertising will be free and can be quite effective, but it won't be right for every business. Nor will college and university initiatives, but for some roles where graduates are exactly what the company is looking for, and maybe we offer training and graduate schemes within our business, then that's great. We can start approaching colleges and universities. They'll often be very agreeable to that kind of linking up because it benefits their students. Job adverts can range in price. We can do the free adverts on the likes of Indeed and other job boards, and most job boards will then offer paid options as well, which will often get your advert more visible. And again, they can range in cost depending on how much you want to boost that advert and how long you want it to run for, and those kinds of things. Referrals are a good way to incentivize your existing team to recruit for you. So thinking again of that values-based recruitment, if you've got an existing team who share those values and are happy to be cheerleaders for your business, which is always a nice place to be, then incentivize them to spread the word when you are hiring. If your team are able to bring people who are like-minded and share those values as well, you could give them a small bonus to say thank you. It will most likely end up more cost effective than going through that advertising and screening process yourself. So you would still put them through some kind of screening, of course, but you might not need to then wade through loads of CVs in order to find the right hire. So there's lots of options there when it comes to placing the advertisement. Now, we often get this kind of debate coming up in training sessions and workshops around application forms or CVs. And the most common thing that we see is job advert goes out and candidates are asked to send in a CV, which is absolutely normal and absolutely fine. But there are some potential benefits to having an application form instead, whether that's on your website for people to download, or whether actually it's an automated response when you get a CV to ask people to fill in an application form. And of course, the key is how easy can you make it for people? We don't want to put too many hurdles in the way for people to apply, particularly if it's not a job that requires a lot of admin, because someone might not necessarily be good at filling in an application form, whether that's in paper or online. But what an application form can do is allow you to standardise the candidate's interests, because you're collecting the same information in the same format, and everybody's got the same opportunity, therefore, to provide the information that you've asked for. It then makes it really, really a lot easier to compare the information that's provided, because you're comparing like for like, whereas CVs will come in all sorts of formats. Some will be formatted better than others. Some will be terrible and really hard to read. Some will be brilliant and very creative. So having actually that application form where you're asking the questions that you need to know the answer to can allow you to compare easier. And on that note, it does also allow you to be in control of the information that you're gathering during the recruitment process. With a CV, that control is really in the candidate's hands, because they could leave information off the CV. They might give you too much information about certain things that aren't relevant. Whereas an application form, you are being very specific in what you need to know. So if you do want to know about particular experience or particular qualifications, you can gather that information there and then. And also remember that there are professional CV writers out there, and this is not a bad thing. They are great, and I know a few myself, and they really help people to get jobs. However, you've got to then be mindful that when you receive CVs, they aren't necessarily the truest reflection of the candidate, because they might not have actually prepared that CV. And actually, the way a CV is laid out can actually help us form an opinion on someone, because we might look at it and think it looks really professional. The grammar's great, the spelling's great, it's all laid out. This person's obviously got great computer skills to be able to do this. Well, not necessarily, because they might not have actually done the CV themselves. Again, I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing, but it's just something to be mindful of. And actually, creating a simple application form doesn't take too much time either, so it's not a huge task if it's something you did want to incorporate into your process. So moving on to selection methods, there are so many ways to select candidates, and here are just a few of them. So telephone screening interviews, I've also got Zoom interviews on there at the bottom, and it's a similar premise really. We're avoiding the travel, the need to book a venue, and potentially the longer amount of time that a face-to-face interview can take up. So carrying out telephone screening or Zoom or online interviews can be a big time saver. We again have to be mindful that for some roles, people might not be great on the phone and people might not be great at computers. But if that is a key requirement of the role, then it's a great opportunity to test those things out. And actually, things like telephone interviews also help you test out, does someone arrive on time for the call? Do they actually know that you're ringing when you've said you will? Have they put it in the diary? Are they in an environment that's appropriate to having a telephone interview or a Zoom interview? Because if not, again, it can help you understand their way of thinking and decide whether that's what you want for this particular role that you're recruiting for. Work sample tests can be good at actually testing skills for a job. So put some examples there, like giving them a case study, an intro exercise, or an IT exercise of some sort. So making sure that the sample test is actually something that they would potentially do in their job. I once interviewed for a job and they put me through like a role play on the telephone, and actually the job I was applying for involved next to no telephone work. So it was a little bit irrelevant in terms of testing skills. So it is just making sure that you're not potentially wasting anybody's time by doing those kind of exercises, but they can be really good to test the skills that someone has told you that they have on a CV. Role play, I'm sure, makes a lot of people cringe. It still does, but it can be a brilliant way to test certain skills and behaviours out, things that maybe couldn't be tested in a written exercise of some sort. Presentations can be good, again, particularly if the role is one that might require presentations of some sort. So salespeople, business development might be required to present in their day-to-day activities. So why not test that out in an interview setting? Personality profiles and psychometric tests are more popular these days. I'd be very wary about using them to judge people on in terms of whether we hire them or not. But actually, in terms of making sure, again, we're testing values and understanding as well their thought processes, because we can sometimes then tailor our face-to-face interview questions to get the best out of these people in an interview setting. And I've already mentioned Zoom interviews, but video CVs is also becoming more popular. This is a tool that I've used myself as well, where someone has sent in the CV and we actually want them to just summarise the CV for us in a 5-minute video. Again, you can imagine this won't be suited to all types of roles, but particularly if you were hiring maybe a social media person or a creative digital person, asking them to actually talk you through their experience in a video and maybe put some creative spin on that video might be a great way to test out some of those skills, might it? And also can save you a lot of time in the hiring process as well, because actually watching a 5-minute video CV and actually getting a feel for the person can be quite a good use of time in a recruitment process. But again, not for every role. It won't work for every role, certainly. So interviewing. It's still the most common way to screen a face-to-face interview. I think everybody who applies for a job would expect at least some stage of the interview of the recruitment process to be an interview. And we therefore need a consistent approach that is professional and is also efficient. And one reason that consistency is important is that we must ensure that all candidates that we interview are given a fair opportunity. That removes the likelihood of unconscious bias influencing our decision making, and it also enables you as a hiring manager to be more objective as well. So this is just an example of a structured approach that you could use when you are preparing for an interview. And that key thing is there, starting with prepare. And that could mean making sure you've got the CV in front of you, making sure you know if there are any gaps in that CV that you need to check up on in the interview. Make sure you know who this person is, really, as much as you can before they arrive for the interview. And then when they arrive, making sure we spend a little bit of time building rapport. We're trying to make the person feel comfortable. We want them to be themselves as much as they can be in an interview setting before we launch into the formal interview. Again, as I said, we're not trying to catch people out in an interview. We're trying to get a good feel and understanding for who they are as a person and whether they're the right fit for the business and also for the role they've applied for. So we then carry out the interview, asking the questions that we will have prepared in advance. And some of those will be questions that we ask to everybody, and some might be more specific to this individual's experience in a certain role, for example. When we close an interview, we're always going to be telling the candidate what we're going to do next. Make sure that they have the opportunity to ask any questions as well, but make sure they know within what time frame are we going to get back to them. Will we be giving them feedback if they're unsuccessful? If they are successful, what's going to happen next? Is there going to be a next stage, or will they be asked to come back in, or will they be told over the telephone? Just set those expectations so that people don't go away from an interview wondering what on earth's going to happen next. And after the interview is closed, you can do an evaluation of what's being discussed, and you can only evaluate well if you've taken good notes in an interview, especially if you're doing an interview setting where you've got a few in one day, which we often find is the case. Make sure you're taking notes, because you need to not only evaluate them afterwards, but you're going to need to potentially compare answers as well. So evaluating those answers against your job spec or against any scorecard that you might have put in place to say, well, what's a good answer to this question? That's always going to be helpful and should be done for every candidate. Again, sometimes unconscious bias can lead us to want to hire the person that we got on with the most, that we had the most in common with, rather than the person who demonstrated that they are the most competent for the job. So just something to be mindful. Okay, competency-based questions. There are all sorts of questions that you can ask. in an interview. And I would say when you're designing your interview questions, just ask yourself whether you are bothered what the answer is. And the reason I say that is that if actually we're asking a question and we're not really sure why we're asking it, probably don't bother asking it, because that means the answer potentially isn't something you're interested in, and you could use that time asking something that's much more relevant. So we often see the where do you see yourself in 5 years question, and sometimes that might be relevant if you're looking for someone who's going to stay with the business long term and who's potentially going to be looking to progress or be part of your succession plan. That might be relevant. But in most cases, I would suggest it might not be. And if we're not sure what a good answer to our question looks like, probably don't ask it, and maybe just think about how you could tweak that question to be relevant for the role. And competency-based questions are a great way to actually test someone's potential competency for the role. So considering any real life scenarios where maybe these have come up in the past and potentially staff have dealt with it really well and you want to see that replicated. Or on the flip side, maybe you've had a scenario where staff haven't really done what you'd expect them to do. These could form good competency-based questions. So competency-based questions might include things like, talk me through a time when you experienced this. Explain to us your understanding of this. And that could be a policy, it could be a way of working, it could be an industry, or it could be the type of client that you work with. It could be a range of things. Consider this scenario. Tell me what you would do. And this is where those real life scenarios can come in useful. Or even just considering what are the most common scenarios that are going to come up in this specific role. It might be a scenario involving a challenging customer, or it might be involving a problem that often comes up that needs solving. But finding out how they would deal with that is going to be really helpful. Have you ever dealt with this? Tell me how you responded in that situation. Again, we're testing them in terms of their experience. Have they actually dealt with that? Sometimes as well, people will say things like, no, I haven't really dealt with that. However, I have dealt with this similar scenario. And again, that's really helpful for understanding how they think and whether they're able to demonstrate transferable skills, whether they're able to almost put themselves in a situation hypothetically if it's not something they have dealt with before. So again, really just helpful ways of understanding their thinking. So I would strongly recommend at least some competency-based questions in your interview process, as well as values-based questions. And values-based is the similar concept, but just trying to pull out someone's core values and understand what's important to them. So actually, if you do have a team who upholds strongly the value of reliability, you could start asking questions around how do you feel when someone turns up late for a meeting that you've pre-booked in the diary, and if they're not that bothered, I'm late all the time, well, you might start realizing that reliability isn't one of their core values, which might help influence your decision as well. Okay. So just a quote there, which is one of the biggest communication problem is that we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply. So just a note really to be careful in interviews to make sure you do listen and you expand on the answers. So don't forget to listen to what they're actually saying because you're thinking about what your next question on the list is, because sometimes that can happen, particularly again, if we've got back-to-back interviews, it can become almost a checklist of questions and we're just noting down the answer rather than listening so that we can probe into that answer a bit more. So when someone is speaking in an interview and giving you an answer, try your hardest not to interrupt them. Let them talk and finish their answer in full. Remember that the person is probably at least slightly nervous, ranging to very nervous, depending on them as a person. So let them finish, because interrupting is likely to throw them off course and they won't then give you the best answer they could have. Let them finish and then pick out the relevant bits. You'll be taking notes, so you can go back through your notes, show your active listening skills by repeating what things that they've said to you and using those notes to probe a bit further into the responses as you need to. And Silence. This is something that I was actually taught a bit more in mediation training, which I did a few years ago. And it's all around the idea of actually embracing silence. It's a really good skill when you have to um, when you are able to allow silences in an interview, because it can seem awkward. A lot of people will say silence is awkward. So if you can get yourself into the way of thinking of it's not awkward and just embrace silence, it can be really helpful. So when you're asking a question in an interview, for example, and the candidate is pausing to think, and maybe that pause is going on for a few seconds longer than is comfortable, really try not to jump in and start trying to help them out by putting words in the mouth. It is a natural instinct to do that because we don't want the person to feel awkward. We also don't want to feel awkward ourselves. So start trying to avoid the silence. But if you can sit and wait a bit more and then wait a bit more for them to answer, you will hopefully get the answer that you're looking for at the end. And at first, it will probably seem quite unnatural and potentially a bit painful, but it is very effective because, first of all, you'll get to see how they respond to silences. Are they quite comfortable using the time to think, or are they flapping? Do they start waffling because they're trying to just avoid silence like the plague? They'll also be under pressure at this point, and you'll get to see how they respond to that pressure. Again, do they start garbling and maybe giving you an answer that's not the best, or do they use that thinking time and end up giving you quite a well-formed answer because they weren't feeling the pressure at all? And it'll also give you a chance to see how their thought processes work and how deep they think about something. If they are then able to give you a well-constructed answer through just a few extra seconds of silence, because extra seconds of silence can seem like minutes in that kind of pressured environment. But I would just give you that tip to try it out. It can seem awkward, but once you get used to doing it, you realize it's not, and actually people do value that silence quite a lot. So let's think about final screening then. We've done our interview. We've therefore been able to offer the job to someone. First of all, we should make sure that's a conditional job offer. That would be a tip from me. It's conditional upon whatever you need it to be. So that could be references. You might need to get satisfactory references, particularly in a regulated environment. You might need background checks. So it could be criminal record or credit checks. You might need to verify their qualifications or any required registrations that they need to hold. You need to do a right to work check. So everybody's offer of employment should be subject to and conditional upon you being able to verify the right to work in the UK. And that should be done for absolutely every candidate. And even health questionnaires. The caveat I put on health questionnaires is that you should not ask health related questions before offering a job to someone unless you are asking a question around, do they need any adjustments to attend an interview or to take part in any of your selection process? Otherwise, we shouldn't be asking health related questions. But after you've made a job offer, you could ask for a health questionnaire to check their fitness to work. What I would say is if something comes up on a health questionnaire that is of concern, I would recommend that you seek further advice on that and don't make a recruitment decision purely based on that. So you might need to get occupational health advice, for example, to make sure. So I certainly wouldn't be withdrawing a job offer based purely on a health questionnaire, because it might be considered as discrimination. So always take advice if you're unsure on that. But there are those further considerations. And if you've made your job offer conditional, if someone doesn't then pass your final screening, you can legitimately withdraw an offer of employment without notice, should you need to do so. Okay. So final tips, and then we're nearly finished on the content. Throughout the recruitment process, do keep in touch with your candidates. Sometimes the recruitment process can go on for a couple of weeks or even more, and we don't want candidates to think that we've forgotten about them, even when we've offered the job, because it might be that they're then in a notice period with the current employer, so they might not be actually starting with us for a few months. Sometimes notice periods can be 3 months long. So let's not just forget about them and assume that they're going to start with us in 3 months' time. Keep in touch. If you've got an internal newsletter, why not send it to them? If you're having a team event of some sort, a lunch or a social, invite them to it and see if they want to come and meet the team. And just keep in touch. It will really make you stand out as a potential employer if you do that. Again, don't forget about candidates once you've made the offer, and that's talking about those notice periods. Throughout recruitment, do make sure you keep good records. Your notes should all be very objective and professional. I always go on the basis that the candidate might see those notes. They would have the opportunity to see them if they requested them under data protection legislation. Therefore, make sure you're not writing anything that you wouldn't want them to see. And keep those records for the time that's required for you to make that recruitment decision. You might keep records for longer. Sometimes we see in data retention policies 6 months for recruitment, because ultimately, if you have made a decision that is challenged, so potentially someone attempts to make a legal challenge against you for your hiring decision, you need to be able to defend yourself. So I wouldn't suggest getting rid of any notes immediately, because then you're going to struggle to defend such a claim if one was to arise. And that's it from me. That's all the content I wanted to cover. I hope this webinar has been helpful for you. And if you've got any follow-up questions on recruitment in general, I'd be very happy to answer them. I appreciate this isn't a live session as I'm recording it following the original live session. So do feel free to get in touch. You can connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram as well these days. And we do have another webinar coming up. We've got 5 webinars planned in total, including this one. The next one is on the 7th of March 2023, and that will be on the topic of discipline and grievance. Thanks very much for watching. If you've got any feedback at all, I'd be very happy to hear it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.